Well, a lot of things happened with the announcements for the news around 11.1, very soon to be getting playable in the PTR. We could be talking about the reveal of the tier sets, the changes coming to Mythic Plus and even to the raid, as well as the delves, or even the new reputation, the new renown faction specifically for raiding, and the changed rewards for feats of strength. But of course, first of all, we have to start with what is going to apply to everyone, which is the balance tuning, the planned changes for 11.1. There are going to be some major, gigantic changes, practically entire reworks, as well as, well, some specs being completely ignored. Now, this class is not being ignored, although they wish they did, because Death Knight gets basically no changes besides being nerfed in tankiness. That's what Blizzard is saying. Death Knights are just too tanky. Now, you can see for yourself, these are the average death rates in Mythic Raiding right now, and you see that Frost and Unholy are the least deadly of all tanks, only close to one of the tanks Brewmaster. You know, when you die even less than actual tanks in a raid, and far less than your average other DPS spec, you know, that might be perhaps because you are too strong. So you get less bonus stamina from Veteran of the Third War, you also get less magical damage reduction from Null Magic. For Frost, you gain less of an Absorb Shield with Permafrost, and same goes for Unholy. No, these nerfs do not go and apply to Blood, it's just for the two DPS specs. We also don't have really that many changes for Demon Hunter. The most impactful change for Havoc is that any means necessary has been removed. So now your extra mastery scaling with chaos damage for pretty much all of your other sources of damage being turned chaos with damage increase is now removed. While it is not really relevant for your playstyle, it will be definitely relevant for your itemization with the value of your mastery. The only thing Vengeance gets is a QOL in Demon Spikes being 2 seconds longer. Where you do get much more attention is to Druid. Druid gets its long-awaited rework to the general tree, which was complained about very often by Druid players. Now, the result itself is quite visible. Even if you go in the tree itself, you see that you don't really have a lot of options in the bottom third part of your tree, with pretty much the division between melee, caster, and like tankiness, defensiveness. Once you move over to the 11.1 version, now you have way more ways to spread around your options down there, and also way more ways to reach other points. Rather than being forced to take particular talents to go in certain directions, now in 11.1 you have way more nodes connecting to each other. You're way less forced to go down certain ways by taking the same abilities, even if you were, for example, a feral druid who didn't care about some caster abilities, or vice versa if you were a balanced druid not caring too much about melee abilities. One of the major wins was the long requested talent like Fluid Form, which allows your Skull Bash, meaning your interrupt, that can now be used in any form and shift you automatically into cat form if necessary. So now you can also have much more easily your single target interrupt as a druid without having to shift form beforehand. What is perhaps the downside of this is that Feral and Balance are pretty much completely ignored. Guardian Druid gets some very cool changes. The stocks of Guardian are actually going up quite a lot with these changes. Two changes in particular. One, your Frenzied Regen cooldown being reduced by 20%, which was, to be fair, good. It was like a 7-second cooldown reduction. Now gets changed to something much stronger. Now it heals for 2 additional seconds. This is 50% stronger. Don't be misread just because you think, wait a second, does this mean that now I'm gonna be healing for 24% of my health over 3 seconds, and instead now it's gonna be 24% of my health over 5 seconds? That's just weaker. No, you get the extra duration and the extra healing, so it's 50% more healing from Frenzied Regen, and you also get to cast Reju and Regrowth on yourself at 200% effectiveness with this talent. On top of that, you lose the reset chance, the double cast chance of Ironfor, and the reset chance of Frenzied Regen for something Guardian Druids have been missing for a lot, which is magical damage reduction, equal to 10% of your armor. You can get upwards of like 90% physical damage reduction with your armor, so it can be like a 9% magical damage reduction with this talent. So it's actually very positive changes, at least on paper, for Guardian Druid. The other positive change is for Resto Druid. because now your mastery has 30% better effectiveness but reduced with each additional hot. Now, especially if you don't play a Resto Druid, you might be wondering, hold on a second, my experience of a Resto Druid might be rusty, but I seem to remember that that's kind of what Resto Druids want to be doing, right? If you are in a raid fight and you pick a generic Resto Druid over here and you look at their casts, that's kind of what they want to do, just cast a bunch of hots. That is true, but at the same time, that is what they were forced to do to give practically any value to their mastery. So Blizzard now tries to essentially make Resto Druids be more valuable without nearly as many casts of their hots. To get the same amount of values of casting 5 hots now from your mastery, you now only need 2, with the mastery being buffed by 30%. It practically makes you become as powerful as you were before, with a fewer amount of hots being spammed out. Evokers, especially healers, are gonna be very happy with this QOL change, which is the fact that now Dream Breath heals yourself and 5 injured allies instead of just 5 injured allies. Now this comes at a nerf. The nerf is that now Dream Breath and Reversion no longer snapshot with your mastery, instead they will re-evaluate the mastery bonus each time they tick. As you know, the mastery of Evoker makes you heal more if you have more HP than the target you are healing. So if you casted Dream Breath when you had full HP, then for the full duration of Dream Breath you were gaining full bonus of your mastery. Instead now, after you cast Dream Breath, if you get chunked down to 1% HP and literally everyone else has more HP than you, then your mastery will not work. However, this is definitely a worthwhile net nerf to suffer to gain this QOL. This is a massive QOL for Flameshaper Evoker. Flameshaper who has to, remember who had Dream Breath on so they can engulf the target with Dream Breath. Now, all of this is gone. All of this is gone because now you're always guaranteed to get Dream Breath on yourself. The other change, which we sort of fly over because it might require an entire video by itself, is Augmentation Evoker's Ebonmite no longer affects tanks and healers. Now, this is a big misconception. This is actually a buff to augmentation. Not that this is a buff itself, this is not a buff. What is a buff is that now Closest Clutchmates comes back. Ebonmite and Breath of Eons are now 25% more effective. So the TLDR is losing Ebonmite on your tank and healer, but giving your 2 other DPS and yourself 25% more value in terms of stats from Ebonmite, and your burst in Breath of Eons is actually a net gain. Much of your defensiveness, since this was also one of the complaints of the power of Aug Evokers in Mythic Plus, was the fact that they were making tanks and healers tankier. That was mostly coming from the verse of their mastery, even the armor, shield given to the tank, or even the rescue ability that Evokers have, not nearly as much from Ebonmite. So actually this one being removed as a buff from tanks and healers is not nearly as nerfy as you think it is now that Closest Clutchmates is back, in particular when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now we have to pretty much glaze over also Hunter completely, because they are getting massive amount of changes, in particular when it comes to hero talent pack leader, which is completely changed. Like literally every single point of pack leader is no longer the same. So if you go from current pack leader to 11.1 pack leader, it's just all different. Now it is a very flavorful addition, to be fair. Now every 30 seconds you are going to be summoning either a bear, a wyvern, or a boar, which do different things. Bear is full on AoE, wyvern is just buffing you and your pets, so it can also be used in single target, and then boar is primary target damage and cleave around it. And then the base effect is 30 seconds, it gets reduced down to 25 seconds, and then this one can reduce it by 1 second per cast of kill command, so it can go down to like 15-second cooldown to summon these pets. Then you can have your boar empower your cobra shot, you can have your wyvern give you more stacking damage, you can have your bear have a chance to reduce the cooldown of kill command, etc, etc. So it is quite a flavorful change. We might have some panic attacks from some old school BM hunters, because this change might have you have to set up a few more weak auras to track some of the buffs and effects of the new hero talent. However, what is much more of a question mark instead is the change given to marksmanship. Because while BM does get a major change to pack leader, marksmanship pretty much changes the entire spec. It's a full-scale rework. Blizzard themselves are saying we are looking to reimagine marksmanship's sharpshooter fantasy, and they say that marksmanship will lose their pet functionalities, but it is instead joined in battle by a unique eagle pet that will exist outside of the game space but continue to support you in combat in a uniquely marksmanship way. So you have now practically a whole lot of changes to your entire talent tree. You can even see just by the amount of talents being removed, well, it's practically nearly the entire tree of marksmanship. You can then see the changes going from the current live version of marksmanship to 11.1, the severity of the changes for marksmanship. So it will take a bit longer to test all of this, considering the size of the changes, like for example being able to get on the PTR and actually test the entire new spec. There will not be nearly as much testing necessary when it comes to Mage, because they don't get much, especially Arcane and Frost. You do have Frostfire changes. Blizzard is trying to make Frostfire Mage focused more on reducing the incentive to track a bunch of different auras for the effects of Frostfire, but the real change goes to Fire. Fire's problem right now is that they sort of kind of ignore Fireball, and if you're a Fire Mage and you don't cast Fireball, it's kind of a problem. You know, if we take some run-of-the-mill top report of a Fire Mage, you can see that if you look at Fire and you look at their casts, you can see that they are casting Pyro and Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames, and then I guess their version of Fireball is not cast nearly as much, and this is supposed to be your pseudo generator, because you are now overflowing so much in charges of both Phoenix Flames and Fire Blast that you're kind of just going much lower down in casts of Scorch and Fireball. So you now have a series of changes, like for example no longer making Scorch instacast. You have changes like Controlled Destruction being able to trigger from Fireball, Fireball doing 15% more damage outside of combustion, as well as reducing the amount of cooldown reduction you get from Fire Blast, 2 seconds longer cooldown, as well as Phoenix Reborn refunding 1 Phoenix Flame charge instead of 2 charges, all in an attempt to make you play more with Fireball again. Now on to the first big question mark of the balance tuning. You do have some attention given to Mistweaver and some attention given to Windwalker. What of course stands out like a sore thumb is the fact that there isn't even a note for Brewmaster. There's like nothing for Brewmaster. That's the first glaring miss of this balance tuning. Now you also do have no changes really for protection and for retribution. You do have some changes for Holy Paladin. Holy now gets in line with the other paladins in getting their Unbound Freedom. So their double Blessing of Freedom is now back on the talent tree for Holy Paladin as well. Now Blizzard, as they point out, they are trying to make the base power of Flash of Light and Holy Light stronger and nerf the power of the buffs that you need to make those powerful. So you have in particular Holy Light healing increased by 90%. Now the buff you gain from Holy Light healing from Infusion of Light is nerfed from 100 to 30, as well as the one from Inflorescent of the Sunwell goes down from 50 to 15. But the base healing is stronger. This nets out to be a buff to both Flash of Light and Holy Light's healing. Where there is a nerf, which is almost a 10% healing nerf for this current version of Holy Paladin in-game, which is now playing with Avenging Crusader, is the fact that they used to have a bug which buffed significantly their healing, which was the Blessed Assurance of Lightsmith used to buff Crusader Strike by much more than it was supposed to. And because, of course, in case you are not aware, Avenging Crusader makes the Paladin heal based on their damaging abilities, Crusader Strike and Judgment. When you were playing Lightsmith and you were playing with Blessed Assurance, giving you a massive buff after you used a Holy Power Spender to your next damaging abilities, that would then be turned into healing because of Avenging Crusader, this was bugged for Crusader Strike, giving you tons more healing. So between the nerf of Hammer and Anvil and the bug fix, Lightsmith AC Holy Paladin is getting nerfed by quite a bit this current season, although it doesn't have much to do with the planned changes of 11.1. Now, Priest does get the second question mark of the day, because we do have a good amount of changes for Disc as well as a good amount of changes for Holy. And then there is a glaring gap between that and Rogue, which is Shadow, that is not visible right here because it's not there. No changes for Shadow. Now, Discipline does get some significant changes. For starters, Heaven's Wrath, Rapture, and Train of Thought are all removed. So Rapture, which had in this expansion been nerfed down to being terrible, and then you also have Heaven's Wrath, which is the follow-up of Ultimate Penitence, a talent which has never really made it into the playable state for Discipline Priest, as well as Train of Thought, which is, on the other hand, a pretty powerful talent always taken basically by Discipline Priests. They are all being removed in this 11.1 incoming patch. Now, some of the standout changes to Discipline in terms of their positioning around is the fact that now, for example, Lenience and Evangelism are going to be split. So, first of all, it's much lower down the tree for Evangelism. On top of that, it now also has an instant effect. So on top of extending the duration by 6 seconds, it also gives you a 4200% spell power instant heal to all targets with Atonement, which is also going to be a massive heal in Mythic Plus, because it's going to be basically a 850% spell power heal to all 5 players in Mythic Plus, as well as then still being able to take Lenience on top of that. You also have a middle bracket talent for Ultimate Penitence, so no longer in the bottom third. So you have an easier time spending a talent for this time around. Something that also Discipline Priests will absolutely love is that Mind Blast and Penance now reduce the cooldown of Mindbender. No more Smite spam. No more locked into spamming Smite to reduce the cooldown of your Mindbender anymore. Now it's just with Mind Blast and with Penance, with an increased cooldown reduction, of course. In the current version, the cooldown reduction is 2 to 4 seconds, but it includes Smite. Now in 11.1 it will be 4 to 8 seconds, but it will not have Smite. So actually it's, yes, a nerf, because you don't get to cast Mind Blast and Penance nearly as often. Even with the cooldown reduction buff, it will not become back on cooldown nearly as often. But in terms of QoL changes, there is quite a lot for Discipline. Holy Priest, however, gets even more. Holy Priest gets changed even more in terms of drastic effects to their talent tree, going from live to 11.1. For starters, the biggest one in terms of big cooldowns, of course, is that now you no longer have Holy Word Salvation as your cooldown, which Blizzard points out they want to give you a better experience using Divine Hymn while pulling back on the number of raid cooldowns. So Divine Hymn is buffed. Now Divine Hymn is cast over 5 seconds instead of over 8 seconds. It now also has a choice between putting it on a 2-minute cooldown, which is good, or giving you a mini salvation, because now if you channel the full cast of Divine Hymn, you're also pushing out 15 Prayer of Mendings out in the raid, which is again a tiny version of salvation. Another one of the significant changes for Holy is that now all of the power and all of the synergy in your talents around Circle of Healing is now cooked into Prayer of Healing, and Circle of Healing is removed. You also have additional relevant changes, like for example Lightweaver being split from Lightwell, and Lightweaver can now also be used by Prayer of Healing, so reducing the cast time and increasing the healing, not just of heal but also the AoE version of your spells. And now you can also have up to 4 charges instead of 2. What is also perhaps the biggest change is a completely forgotten and unused talent, Restitution, which was in a wonky side of the tree. Now it's actually becoming possibly game-breaking, because very early on you can take Restitution. After Spirit of Redemption expires, you will revive. This is incredibly powerful in the raid, especially because the cooldown of this effect is only 10 minutes, meaning that once you die after a raid attempt, the cooldown will reset. So this means that at the cost of no longer having your 1-minute Guardian Spirit that you usually take with Guardian Angel, which is fine because GS, especially in the raid, is a shit external cooldown, instead you can get a Ankh for yourself. But unlike a Shaman, you don't have a 30-minute cooldown Ankh, you have an Ankh that resets every pull. Also, you still get to go into Spirit of Redemption. You are going to be able to freely cast heals for a whole bunch without having to care for mechanics and then die and rest again. It is a very cool addition, and overall a W for Holy Priests, because now they get to play with a little bit more than their current degenerate playstyle of just spamming heal and flesh heal and then Halo and then really nothing else. We continue the question marks after Brewmaster and then Shadow Priest. Right after them, Rogue is practically completely ignored. You also get Elemental Shaman, mostly ignored. You do have the largest amount of changes for Shaman going for enhancement, as you can see by the amount of changes. Although, to be fair, they look like a lot of changes, but all of this is UI changes. Literally QOL UI changes, like Maelstrom Weapon no longer highlighting spenders when they become instant cast at 5 stacks, but instead they will have a UI overlay at the top when it reaches 10 stacks, or things like Maelstrom Weapon will highlight Primordial Storm when it reaches 10 stacks. All of these are going to be UI changes for enhancement. The bigger changes are higher up, when Blizzard is significantly buffing your base damage. And when I say significantly, I mean this level of significance, literally doubling your damage, at the cost of reducing several of your procs that scaled your damage up and made your spenders way more powerful. One of the bigger culprits of this was the scaling of your spirits, your feral spirits, now no longer scaling your physical damage, but only your elemental damage, and some possible copium to some of the old school aficionados of two-handed weapon enhancement builds, since now Stormstrike can be used without an offhand weapon, dealing only its main hand weapon damage. So technically, this is enabling two-handed weapon enhancement Shaman. Now, Resto Shaman, on the other hand, gets nerfed, because even though none of this is a particular nerf, it's mostly like a net neutral change. What also happened all the way at the top, at the beginning of Shaman, is something else. Ancestral Guidance has been removed. Now, Blizzard is saying that one of the reasons for this was to reduce the overlap between Ascendance and AG for Resto, because they were always used together, which is okay, fine. If you always end up using two buttons as if they were a single one, if you just basically merge them together, then just remove one of them so you just use a single one. However, the problem for Resto Shaman is, of course, that Ascendance at the moment is quite the significant part of your healing when paired with AG. Ancestral Guidance is 5 to 6% of your healing. So the result is that now your talent changes aren't really nerfs or buffs, they are mostly neutral changes, but you lose AG. So for the time being, you are being nerfed as a Resto Shaman. Warlocks get very few changes. You have Soul Rot being streamlined, no longer giving you the Dream Life effect. It's only just an AoE ability, but now you also double the damage of Drain Life by default. Demonology gets, again, attempt number 54 at making Doom a more playable spell. It is a good QOL because now Doom is tied to the cooldown reduction based no longer on your RNG demonic core procs, but rather on your casts of Hand of Gul'dan, which are much more deterministic, because then you always know when you're getting CDR from Doom because you are the one casting Hand of Gul'dan. Destro gets the Earthquake treatment of making Rain of Fire now having a choice node to be able to be cast on the target rather than on your mouse, on your mouse over, on your reticle. As well as another QOL for more laid-back players by allowing you to have an option to passively spawn dimensional rifts instead of having to cast them yourself. The standout changes for warriors are for arms, making you have, again, Mortal Strike, a larger part of your rotation. You get Mortal Strike and Cleave buffed by 15%. You get the buff of Overpower moved over to Mortal Strike, so now your Martial Prowess buff also goes to affect your next Mortal Strike as well. That's the main change going to arms, not really anything else worth of note for the spec. Same goes for Fury. They do have a couple of changes. Titan's Torment being redesigned to get while Avatar is active, cost reduction on Rampage Rage, and Bloodthirst cooldown being reduced by 1.5 seconds, together with the redesign of Reckless Abandon. What is definitely the much bigger question mark for Warrior aren't these minor changes to Arms and Fury, but rather the blanket nerfs going to Protection Warrior. Because even though we start from the bottom, even though we start from the positives, Shield Wall cooldown is reduced by 30 seconds. Plus, amount of damage ignored from the use of Ignore Pain is increased by 30%. Blizzard had a problem with Protection Warrior. Protection Warriors are currently flooded with Rage, which undermines rotational defensive decision making and encourages constant dumping of Rage into Ignore Pain. So what do? Well, now the chance to reset Shield Slam from Devastator is reduced to 20% instead of 30%. Impenetrable Wall no longer increases rage regen. Booming Voice causes Demo Shout to generate 20 rage instead of 30. Champion's Bulwark no longer increases the rage generated by Shield Charge, and then Violent Outburst, the additional rage generated from Violent Outburst, is reduced to 50% instead of 100. So you now are much more starved of rage, but the abilities, the defensive abilities, especially Ignore Pain, is now increased by 30%. This is still a net nerf for Protection Warrior by quite a good amount. It's not just because you are nerfed by having less rage, but because also spending rage gave you benefits, gave you cooldown reduction, gave you more damage if you spent more rage. So if as a Prot Warrior you could choose, would you rather want to cast 1 Ignore Pain to have the same effect as casting 5 Ignore Pains? You would take casting 5 every time of the day because of the amount of rage you would have been spending to cast those 5 Ignore Pains. So right now this change is definitely flat out a net nerf for protection. These are for now the first, hot takes to the changes planned to come in 11.1. We aren't even right now in the PTR. So we're going to be getting several more changes to many of these specs. There are of course still the question marks we have mentioned. Brewmaster is missing, Shadow Priest is missing, the Rogues are pretty much all missing, Prot and Red Paladin aren't really getting much of anything. So you do have still quite a few specs missing. You have quite some changes being very large, like the BM one, the Marksmanship one, Discipline and Holy Priest, Enhancement Shaman. So there will be likely continued changes as we go through the PTR whenever it will go live. At this point, I guess quite soon. But for now, this was the initial reaction to the changes planned for 11.1 to most of the specs. So for today, on this Friday, this is what we can look forward to, these changes planned for the next season. So we are now at the beginning of this weekend, leaving each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with of course everyone who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have this genius take, this revolutionary tech to completely change the play style of Resto Shaman. You will hear about it soon.